this is not a story about the front lines. It's about the city that served them. In 1917, the Great War was raging in Europe. Millions were dying in the trenches of France. Canadian soldiers were going over the top, fighting and dying on battlefields like Vimy Ridge. They were supported by a vast industrial war machine that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, and the single most important gear in that machine was here, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Halifax Harbour was not just a port, it was the gateway to the war. It was one of the deepest, busiest and most vital Allied hubs in the world. From its docks, Canada sent its soldiers, its horses, its timber, and its medical supplies to the front. The city was transformed. It was a city of war, bustling with soldiers, officers, and workers. The entire harbour was a fortress. This is a painting by Arthur Lismer, a naval defence artist stationed there. It was his job to document the war effort. He painted the harbour's defences, the grey sentinels watching for German U-boats. The port was protected by anti-submarine nets guarding the entrance. The port's primary purpose was the convoy system. A convoy was a group of merchant ships sailing together, protected by naval escorts. They gathered here, in the Bedford Basin, a massive natural anchorage at the end of the harbour. It was the assembly point for the journey to Europe. Lismer's paintings captured this scene. Dozens of ships painted in dazzle camouflage, waiting for the signal to sail. The port was choked with traffic. Destroyers, cargo ships, and massive transports like the RMS Olympic, sister ship of the Titanic, seen here returning with soldiers. This constant, chaotic movement of ships was the city's lifeblood. There were oil tankers, tramp steamers, and tugboats, all navigating a crowded, narrow channel known as the Narrows. The city's waterfront was a hive of activity. Cargo was loaded and unloaded 24 hours a day. The city itself, viewed from the harbour, was a dense, thriving community of wood frame houses and brick factories built right down to the water's edge. This map shows the layout, the main city on the left, the town of Dartmouth on the right, and connecting them, the vital but dangerously narrow channel. This was a city under immense pressure, a critical node in a global war. It was loud, it was crowded, and it was running on a 24-hour cycle of urgency. Every ship that entered, every ton of cargo, was one more piece of the war effort. And this photograph shows the Aquitania d'Adia, another massive transport ship, bringing goods through the port. And the scale of the operation was immense. And this was the scene. A harbour full steel, full of soldiers and full of fuel. It was a city that understood risk. The risk of U-boats, the risk of spies, the risk of war. But the rules of the harbour had become lax under the strain. Ships passed each other in the narrow channel with dangerous frequency. This is the CSS Acadia, a hydrographic survey ship that was a permanent fixture in the harbour. It was a witness to the daily chaos. A modern view shows how the harbour is still the city's heart. But in 1917 it was a machine, and this machine relied on thousands of tons of cargo, goods, steel, and explosives. On December 5, 1917, 2 more ships arrived at this gateway. They were scheduled to enter the harbour the next morning. One ship was well known, the SS Imo. It was a Norwegian vessel sailing for the Belgian Relief Commission. It was empty on its way to New York to pick up supplies. The other ship was the SS Mont-Blanc, a French cargo steamer. This is one of the only known photographs of it taken years earlier. In 1899, it was an unremarkable-looking ship, but on this day, it was the single most dangerous object in the Western Hemisphere. Its manifest, a simple piece of paper, was a recipe for annihilation. Deep in its hold, it carried over 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, a volatile explosive. This is what Canadian women were packing in munitions factories, a substance so unstable it could be detonated by a sharp impact. On top of that, 200 tons of TNT, and on its deck, barrels of benzol, a highly flammable airplane fuel. This is a diagram of the cargo. It was, quite literally, a floating bomb. The Mont-Blanc was so dangerous it was not allowed to dock in New York. It had sailed from there on its way to France to join a convoy in Halifax. The ship was under the command of Captain Aimé Lemedec. He and his crew were acutely aware of the nightmare they were carrying. Because of a delay, the Mont-Blanc arrived too late to enter the harbour on December 5th. The anti-submarine nets were already closed for the night. It was forced to anchor outside the gate. The Emo, which was also running late, was forced to anchor in the Bedford Basin inside the harbour. This set the stage for the next morning, December 6th, 1917. The Emo was impatient to leave. The Mont-Blanc was impatient to get in. At 7:30 a.m. the nets were lowered. The Mont-Blanc, the floating bomb, began to pull anchor. At the same time, at the other end of the harbour, the empty, high-riding SS Emo also began to move. They were on a collision course, set to meet in the narrowest, most congested part of the harbour. This painting captures the mood of the harbour that winter, cold, grey, and industrial. Soldiers stood guard on the docks in Douai watching the transports that fed the war. The city of Halifax was just waking up. It was a cold, clear Thursday morning. Children were preparing for school. Workers were heading to the factories along the waterfront. This painting shows the Grills, a patrol ship on duty. These were the ships meant to protect the harbour. But the threat wasn't coming from a German U-boat. It was already inside the gate, sailing past the guard ships. This is the view from Point Pleasant Park, looking out at the harbour entrance, a peaceful view. The city was a tinderbox of wood frame buildings crowded onto a peninsula. This map shows the radius of the blast, a perfect circle. The city of Halifax was sitting at the centre of a target, and it didn't even know it. The Canadian government was encouraging people to join the war effort. Posters called for boys to work the farms. The entire country was focused on the enemy in Europe. No one was looking at the danger right in front of them, the danger they had invited in. As the Mont-Blanc entered the Narrows, it found the Emo sailing directly towards it, in the wrong channel. Two ships in a narrow channel, one a floating bomb, the other impatient. The stage was set for the largest man-made explosion in human history, and it all started with a simple mistake. The morning of December 6, 1917, began like any other wartime day, cold, clear, and busy. At 7:30 a.m., the anti-submarine nets at the mouth of the harbour were lowered. Two ships, delayed from the night before, prepared to move. They were on opposite ends of the harbour, destined to meet in the narrowest passage, the Narrows. This map shows the fatal geography. The Mont-Blanc, the bomb, was entering from the sea. The Emo was already deep inside the Bedford Basin, preparing to leave. This was the first ship, the SS Emoe, a Norwegian steamship chartered for the Belgian Relief Commission. This is what she looked like, a large modern vessel. But on this day, she had a key feature. She was empty. With no cargo to weigh her down, she rode high in the water. This made her difficult to steer and easily pushed by currents. She was a relief ship, sailing under a neutral flag, and she was tragically, desperately impatient. She was behind schedule. This was her sister ship, the Runic. These were workhorses of the sea. They were not nimble. As the Emo began its journey out of the harbour, the second ship began its journey in, the SS Mont-Blanc, an unremarkable French cargo ship, old, slow, and painted a dull wartime grey. She was commanded by Captain Aimé Le Médec. He and his crew were carrying a secret that terrified them. The Mont-Blanc was a floating bomb. This diagram, sketched later, shows the cargo. The ship was packed from floor to ceiling with high explosives for the war in Europe. The manifest was a recipe for apocalypse. At the bottom, 367 tons of wet and dry picric acid. This is what picric acid looked like. It was stored in barrels. It was a primary component for artillery shells. The women in Canada's munitions factories handled these explosives every day. They knew the risks. Picric acid was notoriously unstable. It was known to become more volatile with time. When dry, it could explode from a simple, hard impact or a spark. The Mont-Blanc was carrying thousands of tons of it, crates upon crates, filling the holds. As if that wasn't enough, stacked on top of the picric acid were 250 tons of TNT, thousands of wooden boxes lining the interior of the ship, a tinderbox waiting for a match, and on the open, exposed deck, 35 barrels of benzol, a highly flammable airplane fuel. This was the lighter fluid sitting on top of the bomb. Captain Le Médec was so concerned he had banned his crew from smoking or even carrying matches. He was piloting a 3,000-ton stick of dynamite, and he was heading into the narrowest, busiest channel in the entire harbour. This is the Narrows, the channel of water that separates Halifax from Dartmouth. Paintings from the 1830s show how the city grew around this channel. It was the strategic heart of the port. Another painting from 1797 shows warships anchored here. It has always been a military waterway. This 1891 Admiralty chart shows just how tight the passage was. There was very little room for error. The rules of the sea were simple. Like a road, ships were supposed to keep to their starboard or right side. Inbound ships on one side, outbound ships on the other. The Imo, the outbound ship, broke that rule. Impatient to get to the sea, she was sailing too fast, and she was in the wrong lane. She was in the inbound channel. The Mont-Blanc, the inbound bomb, saw the Imo coming. She was in her correct lane, but saw another ship bearing down on her. This was the Imo. High riding, hard to steer, and moving at nearly full speed. A series of whistles blasted across the harbour, the universal language of ships, signals of confusion. One blast, I am turning to starboard. 2 blasts, I am turning to port. 3 blasts, my engines are in reverse. The Imo blew 1 blast but continued to drift across the Mont-Blanc's bow. The Mont-Blanc blew 1 blast and held its course, as the rules required. The Imo was now directly in its path. Captain Le Médec on the Mont-Blanc knew he could not stop, and he knew he could not, under any circumstances, run aground. The impact would detonate his ship. He steered hard to port, trying to avoid the Imo. The Imo, at the last second, blew 3 whistles and threw its engines in reverse. It was too late. This wasn't a high-speed crash. It was a slow, grinding, fatal error. At 8:45 a.m., the empty, reversing bow of the Imo scraped into the number 1 hold of the Mont-Blanc. This image, though from a different collision, shows the kind of damage a bow can do, a ripping, tearing motion. The Imo's bow tore into the steel hull of the Mont-Blanc and struck the barrels of benzol on the deck. The barrels tumbled. The benzol, the airplane fuel, gushed out, flooding the deck and pouring into the hold, all over the crates of picric acid. The Imo, its engines in reverse, pulled back. As the 2 steel hulls scraped apart, it created a spark. The benzol instantly ignited. A tower of fire shot up the side of the Mont-Blanc. The Imo was only lightly damaged. She was able to back away. The Mont-Blanc was now a drifting inferno. Captain Le Médec knew what was about to happen. He and his crew had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before the fire reached the 2,300 tons of picric acid. This was not a fire to be fought. It was a catastrophe to be fled. He gave the order. Abandon ship. The crew, all 40 of them, piled into the lifeboats. They rowed frantically, not for the Halifax side, but for the opposite shore, Dartmouth. They screamed warnings. The ship will explode. Le navire va exploser. But they were screaming in French to a city that spoke English, and they left the Mont-Blanc, its wheel unmanned, its hull breached, and its cargo on fire, to drift. This is the Halifax waterfront as it looked at the time, a dense collection of wooden piers, factories and homes. The current in the Narrows began to pull the burning ship, slowly, inexorably, towards Pier 6. This is Pier 21, a similar pier, showing how these structures jutted out into the harbour. The Mont-Blanc, a 3,000-ton bomb, was now on fire and floating directly toward the city. This 1759 illustration shows the Halifax waterfront. The city was built to face the harbour. Everyone could see it. And on the morning of December 6th, that is exactly what they did. They watched. The sight was spectacular. A ship blazing with thick, oily, black smoke. Fire engines raced to the pier. Children stopped on their way to school. Workers gathered at the windows of their factories. They were all watching the show. They had no idea they were standing in the blast radius. The fire burned for 20 minutes. The ship drifted. And at 9:04 a.m., it gently came to rest against Pier 6. The fire had reached the hold. Collision was not a crash. It was a slow metallic scrape. At 8:45 a.m., this painting captures the moment, the high-riding IMO puncturing the hull of the Mont Blanc. The IMO, its engines, in reverse, pulled free relatively unharmed, but for the Mont Blanc it was a fatal wound. The impact had toppled the barrels of benzol on its deck. The flammable liquid gushed into the hull, and when the steel plates of the two ships scraped apart, they created a spark. The benzol ignited instantly. A thick, oily, black smoke poured into the sky. On the bridge of the Mont Blanc, Captain Aimé Le Médec knew what no one else in the harbour did. He was standing on a bomb, and the fuse was now lit. The fire was burning directly above 2,300 tons of picric acid and 250 tons of TNT. This was not a fire that could be fought. It was a catastrophe that could only be fled. He gave the only order possible: abandon ship. The 40 men of the crew scrambled into the lifeboats. They didn't row for Halifax. They rowed for the opposite shore, the Dartmouth side. As they pulled away, they screamed, "Le navire va exploser!" "The ship is going to explode!" But they were French sailors, shouting in French to a city that spoke English. The warning was lost in the noise of the harbour, and they left the Mont Blanc unmanned, its wheel abandoned, and its cargo on fire, to drift. The harbour current, as seen on this chart, began to guide the burning ship. It drifted slowly, like a funeral pyre, across the Narrows and directly towards the Halifax waterfront, towards the dense, wooden, industrial heart of the city. It was heading for Pier 6. This photograph of nearby Pier 21 shows the structure, a long wooden pier covered in sheds and railway tracks. Pier 6 was the industrial hub of the waterfront. It was surrounded by factories, warehouses, and the city's rail yard. And on the shore, people began to watch. The sight was one of the only photographs of the fire taken in the minutes before the explosion, a massive, terrifying column of smoke. This painting, the Halifax Explosion as it occurred, shows the scene, the ship ablaze right next to the city. The city stopped. This was the most dramatic event the harbour had seen in years. Workers in the factories left their machines and crowded the windows for a better view. Children, on their way to school, stopped to point at the spectacular fire. Residents in the North End, the neighbourhood closest to the pier, stood on their porches and watched. This letter, written by an anonymous survivor, describes the scene. The spectacle was magnificent. We did not realize. No one realized what they were looking at. They saw a ship fire. They had no idea they were staring at a 2.9 kiloton bomb. They were all gathered inside the kill radius. This map, created later, shows the devastatingly perfect circle of the blast. They were at its center. The city's fire department raced to the scene. The fire engine, Patricia, the first motorized engine in Canada, raced down to Pier 6. The firemen were heroes. They were the first to arrive, and they were the first to die. They unrolled their hoses on the wooden pier and aimed their water at the heart of the inferno. This is Pier 21 in 1934. Pier 6 was its twin. The firefighters were standing on a structure like this, directly next to the burning explosives. Other ships in the harbour, like the tugboat Theodore, were a common sight. They too watched the blaze. The ship Stella Maris was nearby and was hit by shrapnel, but its crew tried to help. The crowd grew larger. This is an immigration hall at Pier 21. These halls were full of people, workers, immigrants, soldiers. Mothers held their babies up to the window to see the fire. Children stood on the tracks of the rail yard, pointing at the smoke. This image, though from a different pier, captures the scene. A crowd at the water's edge, completely vulnerable. The Mont Blanc, now glowing red, drifted, and at 9:04 a.m. it gently came to rest against Pier 6. Fire had been burning for 20 minutes. Deep in the hold, the fire reached the picric acid. The ship was a pressure cooker. The volatile acid, heated by the benzol fire, had reached its flash point. This is the cargo, thousands of tons of munitions. This is what TNT looks like. This is what detonator cord looks like. This is what a blasting cap does. A small spark to ignite a larger charge. The fire was the spark. The Mont Blanc was the charge. It was the largest charge ever assembled by man. The smoke plume was colossal, a dense black column that could be seen for miles. This restored version shows the terrifying oily texture of the benzol smoke. This is the last thing the crowd at Pier 6 saw. The last thing the firefighters of the Patricia saw. The last thing the children in the windows saw. This newspaper, which would be printed the next day, tried to capture the scene, but no one was prepared for what came next. This was 1917. The world had never seen an explosion of this magnitude. They were watching a fire, unaware that they were seconds away from being vaporized. The ship, its red-hot hull groaning against the pier, disappeared. It was 9:04 a.m. and 35 seconds. The Mont Blanc did not explode. It detonated. It vanished in a white-hot flash, brighter than the sun. This is a modern demolition, a controlled blast. What happened at Halifax was the equivalent of 2,900 tons of TNT, the largest man-made explosion in history before the atomic age. It was 9:04 a.m. and 35 seconds. The Mont Blanc, pressing against Pier 6, disappeared. It did not just explode, it detonated. In an instant, the ship and its 3,000-ton cargo were converted into a ball of white-hot gas. The temperature at its center reached 5,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. The ship was instantly vaporized. This is the moment. The only photographs of the event were taken from ships miles away. A column of fire and debris that climbed 2 miles into the sky. This was the largest man-made explosion in human history. It would hold that record until the first atomic bomb 28 years later. The force was 2.9 kilotons. To understand what that means, we must look at the atomic age. This is the Trinity test, the first nuclear bomb. It was 21 kilotons. This is the Little Boy bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. it was 15 kilotons. The Halifax explosion was a non-nuclear blast with the force of 1/5 of the Hiroshima bomb. The city of Halifax was subjected to an atomic-scale event. In 1917, first came the heat. The flash incinerated everyone and everything on the waterfront. The firefighters, the children, the workers, they were gone. Second came the blast wave. A shock wave moving at twice the speed of sound radiated outward. This map shows the radius of total destruction over 1.6 square mile, 400 acres. It was flattened. This is what it looked like. The entire north end of the city was erased. It was not damaged. It was gone. This view from Pier 8 shows a landscape of foundations and ash. This is the view from the waterfront. A panoramic nightmare where a thriving city stood. There was now only rubble. This photograph, looking north, shows the absolute desolation. Campbell Road, the main waterfront street, vaporized, houses, factories, and the rail yard, all gone. The Hillis & Sons foundry, a massive brick building, was reduced to a pile of bricks. The shockwave shattered windows 50 miles away. The sound of the explosion was heard 200 miles away. In the city, the air pressure was so intense, it tore wooden homes from their foundations. This was a 2-story house. This was a residential street. This was the Army and Navy brewery, simply deleted. The Mont Blanc itself ceased to exist. It was blown into shrapnel. Its 90mm cannon was found over 3 miles away. This, an anchor shank weighing half a ton, was found over 2 miles away. A piece of window glass was embedded in a wall like a knife, a relic of the impossible forces at play. Then came the water. The blast was so powerful, i.e., it vaporized the water in the harbour, exposing the sea floor for an instant. The water then rushed back in, creating a massive tsunami, a 60-foot wave. The wave surged over the waterfront, drowning those who had survived the blast. It picked up the SS Emo, the 5,000-ton ship that had started it all, and threw it like a toy onto the opposite shore of Dartmouth. This is where she landed, beached, broken, a monument to the disaster she had triggered. This restored image shows her high and dry on the Dartmouth coast. Half her crew was killed. This is another view of the beached Emo. The tsunami had carried her over a quarter mile. This is a painting of the Emo being tossed by the wave. The harbour, which moments before was full of warships and freighters, was now a scrapyard. The blast, the fire, and the tsunami had created a new world, a silent, grey, smoking landscape. This is the view from Pier 8. This is the view from the Hillis foundry. This is the view from the waterfront. Total destruction as far as the eye can see. The explosion was pure, non-discriminatory physics. It destroyed everything. This was the Richmond railway station. Gone. This was the Nova Scotia car works, a twisted skeleton. This was St. Joseph's Church, a hollowed-out shell. This was another church, its steeple and its congregation erased. The Provincial Exhibition Building, a morgue before it even had bodies. The community of Africville, a historic black community, was heavily damaged. The Micmac settlement at Turtle Grove, it was completely destroyed, wiped off the map. Soldiers who had been preparing to go to war in Europe found the war had come to them. They were the first rescuers. They began to walk into this smoking, unrecognizable city. They found bodies, and parts of bodies everywhere. Over 2,000 people were killed instantly. This photograph shows bodies being brought to a temporary morgue. Over 9,000 more were injured. The newspapers from the next day could hardly comprehend the scale. Halifax wrecked. This Boston Daily Globe map tried to explain the inexplicable to the outside world. The front page of the Halifax Herald. Dead, 1,200. Injured, 4,000. The numbers were still climbing. The Prime Minister, Robert Borden, arrived to survey the ruins. He was looking at the largest act of destruction in Canadian history. Survivors, dazed and bleeding, walked through the ruins of their own homes. In an instant, thousands were made homeless. They had survived the blast, but they were now exposed to the harsh December air. The apocalypse had come and gone in the blink of an eye, but the true test of survival was just beginning, because that night a new, cold, and silent enemy arrived. The explosion lasted less than a second. The destruction was absolute, but the horror was just beginning. For the 9,000 injured and the thousands left homeless, a new enemy was approaching: nature. That night, a blizzard descended on the ruins of Halifax, one of the worst in years. It was a second, silent, cruel catastrophe. This is what the survivors woke up to: the apocalyptic landscape of rubble, now covered in over 16 inches of snow. The snow covered everything: the ruins of homes, the frozen bodies of the dead, and the living who were still trapped. The blizzard halted the initial rescue efforts. Trains carrying doctors and supplies were stopped miles outside the city. Survivors, like this family, were left to huddle in the ruins of their own homes, freezing to death. This was the scene: a city of 20,000 instantly homeless, now trying to survive a blizzard in a landscape of total destruction. This was a street. The snow and ice made rescue work almost impossible, but the city and the world rushed to help. The response was one of the greatest relief efforts in history. The undamaged parts of the city became vast emergency centers. This was the line for food supplies, stretching for blocks. People were desperate, registering for aid, trying to find lost family members. Registration bureaus were set up to try and create order out of the chaos. Every large building that was still standing was converted into a makeshift hospital. This gymnasium became a field hospital lined with cots. The YMCA building was converted into an emergency ward. Nurses worked around the clock, preparing bandages for the thousands of eye injuries caused by the shattered glass. The injured lay in rows, waiting for care. This was the scene at St. Mary's Hospital. Doctors and nurses poured in from all over Canada and New England. The city became a refugee camp. Tent cities were erected to house those who had lost everything. The Halifax Relief Commission was formed. This was its headquarters. It was tasked with the impossible: feeding, housing, and rebuilding the entire city. This is Judge W.B. Wallace, who chaired the commission. He oversaw the distribution of millions of dollars in aid. The commission built thousands of temporary apartments on the garrison grounds, and they began the slow, brutal work of rebuilding the North End. The most immediate and most critical aid came from Boston, Massachusetts. Within hours of the explosion, Boston sent a relief train loaded with doctors, nurses, and supplies racing through the blizzard. This is Henry B. Endicott, who organized the relief effort. This is the American relief team in front of their hospital, Bellevue. They were the first to arrive, and they saved countless lives. This is Governor Samuel McCall of Massachusetts, visiting the ruins to pledge his state's support. The bond between the two cities was forged in fire and snow. The dead were given mass funerals. So many were unidentified. They were buried in long trenches. The city was in mourning, but it was also being reborn. This is Veith House, a children's home destroyed in the blast, and this is Veith House rebuilt. It became a symbol of the city's resilience. Even that same month, a Christmas party was held for the orphaned children, a moment of light in the ruins. But the scars remained. The city of Halifax is a living museum of the explosion. This is the anchor shank of the Mont-Blanc. It weighs over 100 pounds. It was found here, 2.5 miles from the blast. It is a permanent physical reminder of the explosion's power. Today it sits as a monument, a silent, twisted piece of steel. The anchor's resting place is a memorial. This is the Halifax Explosion Memorial Bell Tower. It overlooks the area where the Mont-Blanc detonated. It is a place of memory and of sorrow. A sculpture dedicated to the victims stands in the north end. A small fragment of the ship is on display at the Maritime Museum. Even the ferries that cross the harbour today carry the names of its heroes. This is the Vincent Coleman, named for the telegraph operator who stayed at his post to send a final, heroic message warning an inbound train and saving 300 lives before he was vaporized. 47,000 or 40,000. His name now crosses the Narrows every day, passing over the spot where the Mont Blanc disappeared. His name now crosses the Narrows every day, passing over the spot where the Mont Blanc disappeared. And then there is the most famous legacy of all, the city's gratitude. The next year, in 1918, Halifax sent a gift to the city of Boston, a large Christmas tree. It was a thank you for the relief train that arrived in their darkest hour. The tradition was revived in 1971, and it continues to this day. Every year, Nova Scotia fells its best tree, sends it to Boston, where it is lit on the Boston Common. It is a symbol, a living annual reminder of the bond forged between two cities, a bond of gratitude that was born from the worst man-made explosion of the pre-nuclear age. A ceremony is held every year. A 100th anniversary event marked the tragedy. The Halifax explosion was a perfect storm of wartime chaos, human error, and bad luck. It was a day when a simple, slow-motion mistake vaporized a city and brought on a blizzard that tested the very limits of human survival. A story now written in monuments of steel and in a single glowing tree.